Last segment, we mentioned the fact that, work is an action. Laziness is an action or a lack of an action, however you look at that. And it's also the attitude, which brings us back to why we do what we do. So you mentioned clearly that the fool, as the Bible would use it, is a person who mocks God, says, I'm not going to do what you say, God. So a lazy person in that regard would be somebody who says, I want to do my own thing. I don't want to do your model, God. We haven't used the word worship yet. I'd like to get your concept of work as worship. And if that's the case, then as a believer, understanding the balance of our duties and responsibilities, how that perhaps can drive the balance of the person who could be a workaholic, we put him that way. I don't think the Bible says anything about working too much. It's the balance of what we do and keeping these things perhaps in perspective. How did you take and present that kind of a concept to your congregation?
And that's an excellent phrase, work as worship. And throughout the New Testament, especially in Paul's letters, he'll often say, everything that we do it as unto the Lord. We do our work as unto the Lord, that ultimately it's more than just for our boss's eyes. It's more than just for our paycheck. It's more than for even that wonderful feeling of fulfillment that God has embedded into us when we're able to use the calling that he's given us. But ultimately, all that we're doing is for his honor and glory. So the Catholic Church, I think during the Middle Ages especially, kind of created this false dichotomy between the clergy and the laity. And if you were a priest or if you were a nun, you were in a different category. But no, everything that we do as believers, if we do it unto the Lord, it's an act of worship. So therefore, we can rely on the Lord to provide for our needs. That's why we can take a day off and honor the Sabbath, trusting that God will provide. That's why we sleep at night, that God created us to spend a third of our lives asleep, trusting that he'll care for us even when we're not doing anything. And it's interesting, that same passage in Ecclesiastes 4, where Solomon talks about, on the one hand, you have someone who's lazy, he folds his hands and destroys his life. On the other hand, you have someone who envies his neighbor and he travails, and that becomes vanity and vexation of spirit. But then he says in verse 6, after those previous two verses, better is a handful of quietness than both the hands full with travail and vexation of spirit. And so it's this great picture of a healthy work-life balance, that most of us have two hands. If you have more than that, then that's great. You can multitask with your third hand. But most of us have two hands. So he says, put quietness or rest in one hand, and then put your work, your labor in the other hand, and you'll have a balanced life. But if you try to fill both hands, and the second word in that verse, that hands, is a Hebrew word that has the idea of curving your hand, trying to hold as much as possible. He says if you try to put travail in both of your hands, work in both of your hands, it's going to be vexation of spirit. So finding out, and that's different for all of us in our stages of life, seasons of life, but do I take a day off? Do I honor the Sabbath? Do I plan family vacations? Do I take a retreat with my spouse if I'm married? How am I balancing? On the one hand, I want to have a hand full of work. That's a good thing. But I don't want two hands full of work. I need my other hand to be full of quietness and rest.